All right, welcome, and thank you for inviting me, and Christine in particular, Christine Boulder, for having faith in selecting me. Hopefully I won't disappoint you or disappoint her, but if worst case scenario, you got a lunch out of it, so it can't be that bad. And it's a funny story about the tan. I was in an elevator at a conference recently and connecting with people, and they said, you live out in California? Where's your tan? I said, I work in California. There's a big difference. I'm not outside tanning all the time. So let's get down to business. I have a lot of ideas I want to share with you, and I'm going to do my best to try and make it concise as possible and connect the dots. And I put up here a picture of John Wooden. Many of you would know him and recognize that picture. And I want to make it clear that this is not a talk about John Wooden. But I selected this image for a couple of reasons to open us up. And one is, I think that Coach Wooden and the program that he put in place at UCLA is probably the most well-documented and most enduring example of an integrated talent development system that we have. Surely there are many others, but we have a lot of evidence from his time there that influences what we do. And also, I use this image, and I use him as an opening because of my personal connection to him, working a little bit at UCLA before I moved on to Fresno State, and now most recently as a scientific advisor for a national nonprofit that was inspired by Coach Wooden. And that group is Be Like Coach, and this is a group that I just want to mention them, and it helps set the stage here. They are a group of thought leaders across disciplines, business, education, medicine, sport, and they've been quietly building capacity for the last 5 or 6 years, and many of you in the room have probably been contacted by them at one point or another, trying to find those common elements of talent development systems. So we have across all disciplines, we have a habit of getting very narrow focus. I can tell you a lot about coaching or a lot about medicine or a lot about surgery, but we don't get in the same room very often. And when you start to look across those disciplines in the literature and talk to people, we're all pretty much doing the same things when you look at effectiveness and success. We use different terms and different language, but the principles are the same. And so I wanted to share this group with you because they've exposed me, they've gotten me out of my office, so to speak, and forced me to get up to speed with what the talent development systems, effective ones, look like in other settings. And one of the people involved in that group is Swen Nader, who is pictured here on this side with Bill Walton on the other side. And Swen Nader won 2 championships playing for Coach Wooden in the 1970s, and then played 10 years in the NBA and won a college championship as a coach. And he's a writer and a poet. He's a very interesting guy, and he's really given us direct connection to Coach Wooden's systems. So it's one thing to read about it, and unfortunately Coach has passed away now, but we have a direct connection through Swen, and when Coach was alive, he did help us also. So it's interesting to me, we made this discovery just a few years ago. As you dig and dig and dig and dig, there was something that Coach Wooden did, he put in place for athlete and his own coach development that struck us as being very similar to something the federal government did in the 1940s. And this is arguably, in my opinion, in our opinion, probably the most comprehensive and successful talent development program ever done and created. And if you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to look it up a little bit. It's called TWI, or Training Within Industry. And it's kind of the precursor to lean management and Kaizen and all these other ideas. And what they did was, when the US was pulled into the war, we had to decide very quickly, how are we going to keep up? How are we going to revamp all our factories, retrain hundreds of thousands of people and managers to build new products or build them quicker and more effectively? That's a big job, and we don't have time and years to experiment and do pilot studies. So they created a group, a management group, a federal group called Training Within Industry, and the program was called Training Within Industry. And they went around, and it was a talent development system for training managers, factory managers, and employees on how to learn and how to perform quickly. And they had a whole series of modules, and one of them was job instruction, or JI. You see one of the books here. And they had these cards. This is an example of a card, and you don't have to worry about the fine print too much, but this was a double-sided card. And managers and the factories would be given this card, and they would keep it on them at all times. So as they're walking the floor, they come across issues, dilemmas, they pull out the card, and it's a reminder, here are the principles on how to instruct and teach someone how to resolve a problem quickly. So no subcommittees, no meetings. There's a problem, we need to fix it right now, go back to your principles. And it's interesting to us that, so there's 4 steps to instruction on this one, that when we started digging, we said, you know what? One of Coach's favorite maxims was, you haven't taught until they've learned. And interestingly, right at the bottom of this card from the 1940s, we see probably the origin of that maxim. And it says here, if the worker hasn't learned, the instructor hasn't taught. And that became, that was the title of one of the best books I've seen on his talented development approach. You haven't taught until they've learned. And there's a direct connection there. In fact, Coach Wooden was in the Navy in World War II for a short period of time. And he passed away before we could ask, before we made that connection. But we're pretty convinced that he was exposed to this, and it strongly influenced the talent development system that he put in place at UCLA. And TWI is largely been attributed to being one of the key factors in us winning the war, being able to ramp up and develop talent across a country very quickly. It's really quite amazing. And then we went, and the government decided, well, you know what? We can't leave countries like Japan out there. We just destroyed this country. We need to go and invest in this country and help them build their talent systems back up. So we went over to Japan, the same group, and trained their companies and their leaders in TWI. And one of those companies was Toyota. Later became the #1 company in the world, #1 automaker in the world. And their talent development system is very well described in books like this. These are 2 great books, regardless of what field you work in, because they're coaching books. One book here is on how you create environments, how Toyota creates environments in their factories for developing their talent and their employees. And the other one, Toyota Kata, Kata is coaching. So it's how Toyota coaches their employees. And funny, oddly enough, we forgot it. We got comfortable, right? Toyota in Japan overtook us, and then we went out and said, we got to learn the Toyota way. And we have to learn the Japanese way. So we hired them to come back and teach us what we taught them in 1945. So it's a neat little story. And so this kind of sets a little bit of framework for where I'm coming from, trying to draw on lots of different disciplines, looking at the best of what we have available to see. And one of the groups we're working with now is IBM. They use the same kind of protocols and the same types of principles to guide their work. And I could trace this back even 20 years when I started grad school and went to college and was starting to think about these 2 big questions that preoccupied my mind. What is a good coach, and how do you become a good coach? So these are things that have driven me for a couple of decades now, first starting at the University of Ottawa with people like Pierre Trudel, Dr. Pierre Trudel, then at UCLA with Dr. Tara Scanlon, and most recently at Fresno State. And it's given me exposure to, again, psychology and education and lots of different areas. And it's also put me in a position to kind of stand back and look broadly across these fields at what seems to work. And we wrote a little bit about this in this recent handbook of sports coaching, Jim Dennison, Paul Petrak, and I, where we tried to get, there's 39 chapters in there, we tried to get people around the world share with us the best of what we know in coaching. And then you'll see this coming out soon, this International Sports Coaching Journal. I hope many of you write for us, and if you have any questions about it, please email me. This is a joint initiative between Human Kinetics, the International Council for Coaching Excellence, and AFERD. And we are going to start this, the first issue probably January 2014 is our goal. And we are actively looking for people to write in here, but we want this to be a bridged kind of journal, not another academic research journal, not a magazine, but a bridge. So tales from the field, examples of best practice, plus research. So I encourage you to look for that. And to get to the point, so I want to set the stage and make it clear that this is not a talk about a study or A-line of research or sport-specific information. It's broadly viewed talent development. And how do you get to a system that's effective for developing talent, just like we kind of search on our collective quests, across the landscape trying to find answers. So the purpose of what I want to share with you today is an integrated approach or an integrated framework for developing athlete and coach development simultaneously. Because, traditionally we've kind of separated those things. Athletes get their training, coaches go somewhere else, get their training, but it's not very effective. We've seen in other fields that doesn't work very well. So the 3 principles, I uploaded a handout. Some of you may have seen it already, but the 3 principles that I have found, so this isn't based on a study. I don't have empirical evidence to say these are the 3. But looking broadly across all these experiences, these are the 3 that come up over and over and over again. And I'm going to share with you evidence, anecdotal evidence, research evidence, and then I'm going to finish with trying to do this. Because we have a habit of talking about these things a lot, don't we? Hey, you should try this. Well, go try it. So we've been doing this for the past few years in Fresno, in California. Let's see, does it really work if you try to engineer a system like this? What would happen? And I'll share examples with you with that. So the first principle is settings. Settings trump behavioral intentions. We have decades of research across disciplines to show that unless you change the setting, no amount of training is going to matter. So we go teaching, for example, professional development. We send teachers to all kinds of PD stuff. It doesn't make any difference in student learning outcomes or teacher expertise. They feel better about it, and they go back to doing what they were doing before. Because it's not, you haven't changed the setting they go back to allow them to do the things you want them to do. And this is a picture out of airplane when I was flying back from Europe recently, a picture of Greenland. And it struck me, I said, wow, there's a lot of snow and ice down there. And I grew up in Canada, but not too many places in Canada look like that. And I thought, what if you grew up there? We talk about talent development. Well, how do you develop talent in a system or a setting like that? In fact, Greenland does compete in international events. Some of you may have seen that. And their national sport is association football or soccer. And this is an example of a soccer game in Greenland. I love the bleachers here. I think we could do that in Colorado Springs, I think, in some of our fields, couldn't we? And it struck me that, they want to join FIFA, for example, but they're struggling, so I'm told, to do that. They haven't been granted access or entry. One of the reasons is they can't host international matches. Then it can't grow grass. Right? I don't know why they haven't very well put in artificial turf, but this is an example of a setting that's really, even if you want to be a great soccer player, it's probably not going to happen here. Then you contrast that with a small little country like Jamaica, right? Well documented. 2.5 million people, same size roughly as Chicago, yet they dominate sprinting around the world, male and female sprinting, 100, 200 meter relays, and it's been for quite some time now. So why is it that we can develop talent in a place like that, but we can't somewhere else? And what's happening there? Lots of theories, but basically it matters. Sprinting matters there. And if you've been to Jamaica during the high school championships, you'll see that. I was there in March. Every major newspaper all week, front page, high school sprinting. It matters. 35,000 people going to a high school track and field championships. Kids grow up wanting to do this, right? Settings trump individual behavior attention. If you grow up in Jamaica and you want to be a football player, it's probably not going to happen. No matter how much you want it, you have a great shot at being a world-class sprinter because of the setting you're growing up in. And I like to contrast these 2 images. This is the medal ceremony from the London Olympics, the men's 200 meters. And this is the manifestation of that setting being optimally designed to nurture talent, sprinting talent. You see they swept the medals in the 200. They won, in fact, 75% of the medals in the 100, the 200, the relays at the London Olympics. A little country of 2.5 million people. It's really quite amazing. Settings matter. And then, of course, this has got out into the public through public books like the Talent Code, common things that most of us would read, talking about talent hotbeds. Well, Greenland's not a talent hotbed, for athletic talent at least. Jamaica is. Settings matter. We have lots of examples, and we can go on that one. But what about the science? So we have examples and anecdotal evidence, but what is there research to support that settings really do have that much of an influence on talent development? Yes, there is. And one of my favorite, I've taught a graduate class on talent development for the last 12 years, and I'm always trying to find the latest stuff out there. But I always go back, I start with this book, and I love this book. This is a book by Csikszentmihalyi and his colleagues, and it's actually a study written up in a book. And they followed and tried to contrast teenagers and see what's different about kids who realize their talent and those who don't. And at the time they had beepers, this is going back in the 80s, and they would page kids. And anytime they get a beep, they had a little journal. Who are you with? How engaged are you? How much enjoyment are you getting out of this? What are you doing, right? And so they had a really neat profile of how the settings that kids are in on a regular basis. And then they compared those with kids who succeeded and those who didn't. And one of the key findings was this idea of a complex family. And I see this across lots of literature, but they don't always call it complex family. In fact, I don't know why it's not more common. But a complex family, I'll explain what that is in a moment here, but if I go forward. This appears in other research, like Benjamin Bloom's study on talented performers across domains. This complex family idea is in there, although he never used that term. And then most recently in research like this by Tony Wagner out of Harvard, where he went out and he interviewed and studied innovators across America. And what were their family environments like? It's the same thing. And I even emailed Tony and I said, hey, it's great, but you know, this guy Csikszentmihalyi came up with the same conclusion 20 years ago, and you don't even cite him. You got to read this book. It's the same idea. And so what is a complex family? A complex family is, it's intuitive, isn't it? And we probably live it or have thought about it on our own at some point. It's the simultaneous combination of freedom and structure, autonomy and support. So it's an and type of environment, right? We try and dichotomize everything. Republican, Democrat, black, white, right? You go, or autocratic, democratic. It's both. It's both. It's both. You need both. And you see that in all this literature. And there's a great quote from Tony Wagner's book, Creating Innovators, a reporter summarizing this finding. He said it's kind of a yes-but environment. So yes, you can do that. You want it, for example, I use an example with my kids. One day they came to me and said, Dad, we want to paint on the walls. I could have said, no, you're not painting on the walls. But you don't want to stifle initiative and creativity. So yes, but not our walls. How about our neighbor's walls? No, I'm just kidding. I said, how about our garage walls? Because our garage wasn't finished. Go ahead. So it's a yes, but environment. Autonomy and support, right? And you can create, you see this across the literature and across domains in these successful environments. And it got me thinking, Coach Wooden created a complex family environment. He never used that term. In fact, it wasn't around when he was doing what he's doing. But in practices, it was very structured, down to the minute. Practices, he had practice plans for 40 years in his files. He could tell you what they did at 11:25 on September 22nd, 1965. Every practice plan to the minute. And there's no negotiation, there's no free play, there's no free time. Come to practice, you do what I say, and get out. Quick and done. But, so it's structure. Games create. He liked to sit and watch. He would tell you that he wanted to be surprised in games by the creativity and how his players responded. So he wasn't a puppet master running down the sidelines while the guard's dribbling and, hey, do this, do that. No. The structure of practice, autonomy, games. Go and create. You have the foundation. And then it got me looking into more literature on settings, right? And this is a famous study that Jean Coté and his colleagues put out years ago, looking at this. They found an overrepresentation of major pro athletes in the major league sports from small towns. And Jean and I talked about this a lot. I mean, what is a small town? In this case here, he said under 100,000. I don't know if I consider that a small town, but it's a smaller town, right? And you see the overrepresentation from smaller towns. And they've replicated this study in Europe and in other sports. So what is it about a small town? right? We all have lots of theories, but Jean, one of his grad students, actually just did a study on that. They went out and they did a case study on one of these small towns, a very small town, 650 people, in a small town in Nova Scotia, Canada, that's renowned for winning championships, particularly in basketball. So how do they produce championships year after year after year, state championships in this little tiny town with one gym? What is it about that setting? And what they found is basically a complex family, okay? Kids in small towns have lots of freedom. There's not a lot of choices. You're not scheduled all the time, right? They're not going from piano to music to dance to this to this to this. There's a lot of time where they're kind of free. But they're structured. So the basketball program in that setting in particular is very structured, and you can play up against older kids. You go to the gym, there's basketball going on all the time, there's training events. So freedom and structure. We see it again and again and again. So that first principle, settings matter, and Dr. Ron Gallimore is someone that I've worked with a lot recently, and 40 years of research, a retired professor from UCLA, probably one of the top educational psychologists in the world. And anytime I call him, he says, Wade, don't forget settings. I got an idea. He said, you got to engineer the setting if you want the behaviors to follow. Settings, start with settings. And I think a great example of research to support that is this complex family type of setting. Second principle, needs. So it's nice that you have this idea of a setting, but what are you doing in that setting? So what we're finding is that needs drive learning. You need to take a needs-based approach. And this is not new. Again, you'll see some examples that you're familiar with and go, oh yeah, of course. But we kind of get away from that sometimes. We need to focus on what the learners need at a particular time in a particular context. Not necessarily what we think they need, right? Look at traditional schools. We design it to tell kids what we think they need. Compare that with Montessori schools. What do kids need at specific times, right? Not saying that we got it wrong, but I think there's a better balance that could be had there. And so needs drive learning. And I'll give you an example for if you've ever taught in schools. When you're teaching and a student comes up and says, hey, is that going to be on the test? Basically, they're saying, do I need to learn this? We learn what we need to learn, right? So I came across this really neat example from the military and the Army in particular. And they have, it's very well known that they have what they call very detailed after-action reviews, or AARs. They debrief and they debrief and they debrief and they debrief, on and on and on and on. Every major event. What happened? What did we think was going to happen? What actually happened? And why was there a discrepancy there? Let's fix it and get better. Needs driving development, right? And so this is an example, a picture from Afghanistan, a patrol team out. And I love this quote from a senior military official when he was talking about why they do it that way. Why do you debrief so much? Well, we learned a while ago it's better to learn than to be dead. So in their case, it is life and death. If we don't learn from what we're doing, people die. So needs drive learning. In fact, they feed back all of this. You can look this up. It's amazing. They feed back all these lessons learned into Center for Army Lessons Learned. And there's tremendous amount of information that they compile in there, kind of best practices. In this type of scenario, what happened? What should have we done differently? And they keep feeding it back and evolving. So it's an evolving database of best practices, context-specific best practices. And we see the same thing, for example, in Japan with how teachers, their work is structured, this continuous improvement based on needs. You all live this. You know, our long-term athlete development models are needs-based learning models. And it's designed to identify what do our athletes need at each stage of maturation or development. So it's not necessarily viewed that way always, but it's a needs-based learning system. And we see sports here in the United States and around the world, Canada and England, for example, developing their needs-based learning systems using this model. And I see Anne out in the room, and I encourage you to read some of her recent work. This just recently came out, talking again about how these long-term athlete development models are really needs-based learning models that have to be framed in the proper setting, right? We need all the stakeholders involved. Okay, well, these are neat examples, Wade, but show me some research. Okay, the science behind this, I believe, is a good example of this would be self-determination theory. And this is a needs-based theory of learning and motivation. And it's not unanimously received in psychology, but it has been quite influential, and particularly starting to filter into sport and sports settings and coach development. And what DC and Ryan have found and proposed is that our goals, our learning, our growth is driven by 3 innate needs. Everyone shares these needs for competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And so if you can keep these needs in mind as you engineer your settings, you're gonna hit people where they are. We all share these needs, these common needs. And that's evolved into, this reference is in the handout, so don't worry too much about the fine print here. But people slowly have been adopting this into sport. And there's actually a fair body of literature on this now, people kind of trying it out in sports settings. And Majot and Vallerand created a model for coaching, a coaching model that's driven by a consideration of these 3 basic needs. Basically, they're saying athletes' motivation to persist in practice and do hard things will be facilitated if you can design an environment and coaching behaviors that address these needs. So you meet athletes where they are. You meet people where they are, right? These are basic human needs. And they came up with this idea, or they talked a lot about this idea of autonomy supportive coaching behaviors, right in the center here, autonomy supportive coaching behaviors. What's that sound like? Autonomy, support, complex family, right? But they don't talk to each other. But it's the same thing. It's the same thing. So you see the principles here again. A good example of this, one of my favorite examples in action, is from Dr. Cliff Mallett, who is one of the world's leading sports science in coaching at the moment, in my opinion. And he was an Olympic coach in Australia, a sprints coach. And he started to read about self-determination theory, and it got him thinking, could I apply that to my own coaching? What would that look like? You know, would it work? It's one thing to read about it in a paper, but what if I actually tried it? He re-engineered his coaching environment to follow this autonomy supportive type of environment and helping address athlete needs. And going into the 2004 Olympics, the Australian sprint team was ranked 11th in the world, and they ended up winning a silver medal. Now, I'm not going to say it's just because of that, but Cliff thinks that had a lot to do with it. And it's the only men's relay sprint medal ever won by Australia. So he decided to re-engineer his environment to meet their needs, and it definitely contributed to their success. I can't say it's because of that, but it definitely made a difference in his opinion. And I've seen it firsthand. I see it, I don't have papers necessarily to show you on this, but I've seen it, and you've probably seen it too. I've seen it firsthand in my own work. This is a picture from our women's basketball team after they secured their 5th straight NCAA tournament appearance. Our school has never, ever been in the tournament. This coach came along, started to try and adopt these types of behaviors. 5 straight, so different classes, but the principles are the same. We also see it at work with our golf team. This is a record-setting win they had in the fall. Same principles. We re-engineered the practice environment to meet those needs. Former student, now a coach at Adelphi University, a record-setting year again, redesigning the system based on meeting athletes' needs. It works. But these are all elite sport examples. Does it work with kids? Because a lot of us spend our time trying to develop talent in youth sports settings. I think it does. And if you look at any of the literature on youth sport development, currently, it's usually driven by positive youth development, or PYD, right? And there's lots of different models on that, but the main one would be our 5 Cs. Jean Coté and his colleagues, and including some of the work I did with Jean, kind of condensed those to the 4 Cs. And there's some new research out there contradicting the 4 Cs. But basically, it's a nice framework, and it seems to work. If you look at the 4 needs for athletes, young athletes, we're saying collectively as a field, it's for competence, to develop competence, confidence, connection, and character. Well, does that fit with self-determination theory? I think it does. Competence, connection, and character, and confidence. And you may say, well, what's the connection between autonomy and confidence? You're not going to take initiative unless you have some confidence in your ability to do what you're trying to do. If you don't believe you can do it, why would you take initiative to try it? So I think they overlap very, very well. And the last piece of this little puzzle is related to coaches. What about coaches' needs? So we're talking about athletes' needs, but what about coaches' needs? I think coaches share these same needs too, right? And this model would fit well for coach development. And I've spent a lot of time reviewing the literature on coach development. Some reviews that we've put out recently are in books like this with Pierre Trudel. And we find that despite decades of programming around the world, we don't have really any evidence to show that coach education makes a difference in athlete learning or coach development. We do have some evidence to say they feel better about themselves. They take a clinic, they walk out, coaching efficacy, for example, say, oh yeah, I feel better about myself, great. But now what? I mean, we're going to invest tens of millions of dollars just to make you feel good for a few hours. I think there's more to it than that. And so if we look at go again beyond sport, and we look what works in other settings that have tried to develop needs-based systems. And we look at literature like this. If you haven't read any of Peter Seng's work, I strongly encourage you to take a look at that. Particularly this one, that Schools That Learn. These are all case studies of trying to re-engineer settings, talent development settings. And the other book here is kind of his platform book, considered one of the top business books ever, from what I gather. And he talks a lot about needs-based talent development systems. If you're going to re-engineer a business or an environment, you have to make the learning in context to help address what people need to learn at specific times. Forget the PD, the professional development workshops and in-services. Teach them on the job what they need to learn now. Needs-based learning. And another great example of that is this book here, The Teaching Gap, which is the results of a 10-year, multi-million-dollar international study, probably the most comprehensive study ever, on teaching effectiveness around the world in math and science. And one of the key findings is, again, countries that succeed in schooling have needs-based teacher development systems integrated into their regular work. They don't send them out at the end of the school year for a professional development workshop. The learning occurs in practice, a needs-based learning system. It's one of the key separators between some of the things we do and other countries do that succeed. And we try to adapt this into sport. So, okay, I wonder what that would look like if we tried that in sport. And Ron Gallimore and Pierre Trudel and I wrote a paper recently where we pulled that literature and said, what would that look like if we tried to do it in a youth sports setting? And we hadn't tried it yet, but we thought, well, let's put this out there and see where we can go with that. So we have two principles so far. We have settings, which I believe a complex family fits well. We have needs, think self-determination theory. What about mastery? I think the third piece of the puzzle is you have to want to get better, right? And we've all been in those situations where you're trying to train somebody who really doesn't care, right? So there has to be something in you that wants to get better. So we might say, well, we all have this basic human need for competence, but there's a wide range of competence, right? Maybe just getting off the couch is a big step in my competence. For somebody else, it's a gold medal. So we want to develop that mindset, that mastery orientation. I show this as a picture of Gabby Douglas. She was in the earlier slides, and her story is well documented, having a terrible national championships, falling off the beam 4 or 5 times, I think it was, and then bouncing back, getting better, refocusing to eventually win the all-around gold medal, first woman gymnast, U.S. gymnast to do that. But I want to show you a couple examples that are one right now and one that's historical that I think is fantastic to support this. Any golf fans in the room? I hope there's a few, yes. Okay, but even if you're not, it's all over one of the leading stories in the world this past weekend, the U.S. Open, right? And Justin Rose won the U.S. Open. But Justin Rose is not someone who has always succeeded. And there's all kinds of literature out there on him now, given what has happened. And he was hailed as the next Tiger Woods. When he was 17, he finished tied for 4th at the British Open, arguably one of the hardest golf tournaments on the planet. And he was hailed as the next great golfer. He turned pro at 18. Some of you know this story. And then he went on to miss the next 21 cuts. He failed for a whole year. Didn't even make a single cut in a tournament as a pro. The next great golfer, right? That's pretty demoralizing. But it didn't faze him for long because I believe he was in the right kind of setting. He had the right kind of coaches who had the long-term view. He actually got his card to play on the tour, lost it, had to go back, get it again. I mean, a lot of people would have said, enough's enough, you know, I'm moving on. But he didn't. And we see that culminate 15 years later, right? And he's had a lot of success recently because he focuses on getting better. And I love this quote from his coach, who was in the USA Today just yesterday, I think. You know, people go back to the start of his career, the 21 missed cuts, but if we look at adversity in the right light, it provides a foundation for growth. So I underline growth because we're gonna come back to this idea, foundation for growth. This is one of my all-time favorite examples of this in action. This is Dr. Joseph Murray, first surgeon to successfully complete an organ transplant. And he died recently. And so there's a lot of media attention about him and his life. And he started out in World War II as a medic and spent a lot of his time trying to do skin grafts in the field. Lots of failures, most people dying. This bothered him a lot. He came back into practice after the war, and he made it his quest to figure this out. No one's ever done it, but it's got to be possible. It can save a lot of lives. So he's Justin Rose, persisting. Finally, in 1954, successful organ transplant between siblings. It's a step, but it's not the end, because that's not going to help a lot of people. But to get to that step, 6 failed operations, 6 people died. Keep getting better, right? 30 more failed operations, 30 more deaths to get to an organ transplant between non-related people. Speaking about his approach, this is a quote from Atul Gawande. If you've ever heard of him, you should look him up too. Great, very famous surgeon right now. He's written quite a few good books too. And for him, it was just one by one. How do you make this last operation go better than the last one? Science is a series of dead-end alleys. It's not a eureka moment. It's not an act of genius. It required sticking to this problem for a couple of decades. And I'm convinced, and I see it in my work all the time, that most people don't realize their talent or their potential because they just stop short. They just don't go the distance. You have to have this mindset if you want to maximize your talent. And he ended up winning the Nobel Prize for this. And although he would have said this, I really think what you see here is an incremental view of ability. If you look in the psychology literature, this is how they kind of frame it, that learning, that talent is not fixed, right? And the best science that I've seen on this to back it up is the collective work of Carol Dweck out of Stanford and her colleagues, decades of research on looking at what separates people in their talent development process from kind of an orientation or goal orientation approach. And they separate people by fixed mindset or growth mindset. And this is another great book I highly encourage you to add to your bookshelf. And the fixed mindset is this idea, an entity view, if you will. You have it or you don't. You're born with it or you're not, right? A fixed or a growth mindset, incremental view. It's unstable. It can be improved. And it's amazing, some of her studies, when they look at how teachers interact with kids at young ages, feedback they give. Hey, you're smart. You're really smart. You tell that to a young kid, they start to internalize that. They internalize a fixed view. They start to fail in later grades. I'm not smart anymore. They don't connect. Oh, I didn't work hard enough. So I always tell my teachers, my kids' teachers, don't ever tell my daughter she's smart. Please, don't ever do that. Say, hey, you must have studied a lot, or you must have done a lot of homework to get that score. So growth mindset, and I love this picture. I came across this preparing too. This is a growth mindset. It's not how good you are, it's how good you want to be, right? That's a growth mindset right there. Looking at coaching, applying this to coaching, we see this kind of filtering into the literature too. Melissa Chase at Ohio University did a nice paper on this recently, looking at how might this apply to a coaching environment. You know, how do you coach a growth mindset? That's kind of an interesting thing to explore. And you see one of her conclusions here is leaders need a growth mindset so they can transform themselves as well as others. This is, again, integration. Yourself and others, coach and athlete development simultaneously, possibilities for growth. So you see, we have these common links, but they're all kind of discipline specific. So you try and look at it across and you see these anchors. And I see it all the time, and I'm sure you see this too. Our most effective coaches have this growth mindset. They may never use that term or talk about it that way, but they all share this continuous quest to want to get better, to want to learn. And I see it, you know, go back to Coach Wooden. Again, one of his favorite maxims was, what you learn, or what matters most, is what you learn after you know it all. So even after 9 national championships, he won 10 and then retired. But after 9, every year in the off season, did a little self-study. What can I get better at? Every year of his life. And we've tried to summarize this in some of our recent writing, where we've, again, looking across the literature, we see this growth mindset coming out over and over and over again as a hallmark of effective coaching. And we talk about it a little bit in papers like this. So we have our 3 principles: settings, complex family; needs, self-determination theory; and then mastery or growth mindset. Sounds nice. Seems like there's evidence for it. Can you do it? Can you pull it off? What would it look like if you tried to actually design a system like that in sport? So that's preoccupied my time for the last probably 4 years. And working together with partners in our community and graduate students like Rachel Bertram and Nadine Dubina, who are here, they were foolish enough to say, okay, I'll come along for the ride. Let's see what we can do. And we decided, you know what? Let's get away a little bit from, I'll come and do a workshop for your coaches. Most of them don't want to be there. They don't care. They're busy. Why don't we try and re-engineer your program so that we can meet their needs and their athletes' needs simultaneously using these principles? Let's see, would you be willing to do that? And I learned this from Ron Gallimore too. Don't agree to do it with anybody unless they're willing to commit to 3 years, because it's going to take time. And I found a partner and said, okay, we'll give you 3 years. Let's try it. So this is an example, Fresno High School. We thought, could we take the entire high school as a talent development setting and re-engineer that setting so that using these principles, we can get better as athletes and coaches? Does it work? This is a picture of Fresno High School. It's Fresno Unified's flagship high school, over 100 years old. And Fresno Unified is the 4th largest school district in California, 75,000 students. This school has roughly 2,400 students, 650 athletes, and 21 sports. So lots of fertile ground to test these ideas. And I should also mention that the AD, Mr. David Barton, couldn't be here today, but he said, make sure you tell them, if we could do it here, we could do it anywhere. 55 official spoken languages in this school district. 85% free lunch, lots of challenges, a lot of kids coming in and out of the school, so stability is a big issue. So if we can pull it off here, we think we have some good evidence. So how did we start? Whenever I start to work with a group now, we start with this step. Before we try and re-engineer the setting, we have to identify and clearly articulate what we're trying to achieve, what matters. Why do you have an athletics program? What's the end result of this? Why are we doing this in the first place? And I got this mostly from looking at literature like this with Jim Collins and his group, who did studies out of Stanford looking at what separates great companies from failed companies, and what, companies have a lifespan, but some last, and some do really well. What separates them? One of the key things is a clear articulation of their core values. So Hewlett-Packard, why do we exist? It can't be just to make money. Yes, we want to make money, but why do we exist? Because if it's just to make money, anytime we have an opportunity to make money, we're going to jump at it. And that's how companies fail. Krispy Kreme donuts. They expanded all over the place and tried to branch out, and they failed miserably. Why do you exist in the first place? And this takes a long time. It took us a better part of a year working with lots of different stakeholders. Why do we have an athletics program in the first place? What are we trying to accomplish here? And so we start with core values. And in this particular context or setting, this is what matters. So it's not me coming in saying, hey, this is what you should be trying to achieve. I have some ideas on that. We draw on the literature and positive youth development and things like that. But what matters to you? And in this setting, these things matter. This matters to the superintendent, to the principal, to the athletic director, to the coaches, to the parents. So we're finding out basically what their needs are. What are you trying to accomplish here? For them, it's 3 things, very simple. Participation, get lots of kids out. Engagement, keep them coming back. I want them to come back next year and play again. And achievement. We want to win championships. We want them to get better. We want them to feel good about themselves. 3 simple things, which drove the entire process. And this is uploaded for you too, so don't worry about this too much. I was debating whether to put it in or not. And in fact, I gave a talk last year in Scotland, and one of the people in the audience said, "You had me up until this slide." And then I tuned out. I said, just stay with me, be patient. This is a broad overview of the system. This is an integrated talent development system that took us 2 years, 3 if you factor in a previous school where we started to try it, 3 years of work to find out what matters in this setting, what are their needs, and where do they work? Where do they spend their time? Because otherwise, you're going to fail. Guaranteed to fail. Guarantee you'll fail. You have to spend the time up front to understand the setting. Where are they? If we're going to ask coaches to do something, what are they already doing? How do they already spend their time? Because the number one thing coach is going to say, I don't have time for that. Well, you know what? You're already doing this. This is part of how you do that now. Okay. So I'm going to just walk you through. There's not time to go through this in detail, but I'm just going to walk you through it very quickly. We look at 4 phases of how people spend their time in this particular setting. They have a preseason, an in-season, an off-season, or postseason and off-season. And this varies depending on the sport. They have fall sports, winter sports, spring sports. So different coaches have different needs at different times of the year. So having an all-hands workshop is not going to meet my need if I'm in off-season and you're in preseason. We have different needs right now. So you meet people where they are. So we work 1 meeting with each coach in the preseason. And envision, we call it envision. What's possible? And I got this a lot from Toyota too, and the Army and other places. If we really stretched ourselves, what do you think we could do this year in terms of our 3 things that matter? Our participation numbers, our returners, and our achievement. What do you think we could do? And they, with the coach, they determine what the achievement targets are. And there are some process things, some product things, or outcome things, where they finish in their league, how many kills per game their players get, or how many saves, and things like that. So that's, we identify what's possible. We move into the next part, which is in season. And we basically say, go coach. And this is kind of counterintuitive, and a lot of things I've written about was trying to create learning communities. And you learn in context, and for example, in Japan, they have something called lesson study, where it's a regular part of every week. Teachers meet. So it's not on Friday nights, it's not on weekends, it's not after school. It's part of their work day where they meet in learning teams. And what we try and do here in the US, I find, is we add it on. Hey, after school, let's do it. I got great papers, I got coaching and this and that, and it doesn't work. You have to build it into the setting, natural part of what they do. So we said, you know what, there's a lot of walk-on coaches. It's very common in the US. They're not around. We'll maybe get to that, but for now, just go coach. But we don't want you to forget what matters. So we want you to notice. And this is something I got from Robin Jones. He wrote a chapter on this recently in that handbook about noticing. So when you're out there, they have reflection cards, just a little index card that every coach has. And I think I may have an example of one here. No, I didn't put it up, but there's one in the Olympic coach article that we just wrote. But just a little index card. And on one side is typed in their targets. Here's what you said you think you can accomplish this year. The other side is reflection prompts. So one side, after every game, did we get our 5 shots per game? Did we hit that today? No, we had 4, so it's yes or no. And they just go down the list. Flip it over. Why do you think it turned out this way today? Based on what you did in previous practices. Next one, what might you do differently in next practice to help you get closer to that target? So it's in their face all year long. Don't forget, you said these things matter. This is what you should be spending your time on in your practices. Then, postseason, 1 to 2 weeks at the end of the season, we do what we call examine, and we get lots of data because it has to be data-driven. We have to get away from a coach walking into a principal's office. How'd the year go? Oh, we went 10-2. Hey, great job. There's got to be some metrics and data to drive what we do. And so we collect lots of data, objective data from those cards, subjective data from student-athlete questionnaires, and we pilot tested a toolkit, a student-athlete toolkit that we put forward in this article, Jean Coté and some colleagues of ours at Queen's University, where we propose, if you took this positive youth development and athlete development literature, and you tried to measure, do kids gain competence, confidence, connection, character? What's the climate like? Does the coach create an autonomy supportive climate? We came up with a toolkit, and we've revised and adapted it, and it fits really well. It works really well in this setting now. But in your setting, the questions might look different, but the principles would be the same. And then a week or two later, once we have all the data, we have another meeting with each coach where we basically focus on enhancing. So it's not an evaluation. And initially, coaches thought, oh, who's going to see this data? What's this going to mean? Am I getting fired if I don't meet these targets? That's not a growth mindset. Failure is not fatal in this case. If you're not ever meeting targets 3 or 4 years in a row, we got an issue. But let's start with, here are the gaps. Here's what you said could possibly happen. Here's what actually happened. Let's work on closing those gaps. And what it's allowed us to do, and to my knowledge, this is the only example I've seen it anywhere in a high school setting, maybe even a college setting, of a standardized talent development metric. So you can compare water polo to soccer, to basketball, to track across your entire program. And now principals and superintendents have they can use the same protocol across all their schools, and you can get a very clear handle on how well you're developing your talent, your athletes, your students, your coaches. And so we have, again, here's what matters: participation, engagement, achievement, and then we have the survey feedback, and we get a development rate, standardized scores, basically. And we can get an average. In this case, this particular team, this is one we just finished, they have a 74% development rate. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just, it is. And let's examine. Our goal is always 100%. It's like Toyota talks about having 100% zero defects. May never get there, but it's out there as a goal. Okay, you're working towards mastery. And then it allows us to look across the whole athletics program. And this is the type of thing principals love because they're data-driven. If you want me to invest in athletics, you got to show me evidence that something is happening. You're achieving something. We're getting kids out. They're returning. And so we can look in this case here, some sports are doing better than others, softball, swimming, soccer, for example, where track and field has a bit more work to do. Doesn't mean that's a bad coach down here. We look, in fact, what we're finding is if the feedback, kids love the coaches, they think they're getting better, they're enjoying it, but they're not achieving things, they're not growing. So they enjoy it, which is great, but they're not growing. So we have some work, it identifies needs for learning. Doesn't matter, does it work? Just some qualitative information I got just before I came in here at the end of this season. These are quotes from coaches. The AD said, hey, could you give me some feedback? Do you enjoy this? Does it seem to work? Does it help you get any better? Yes, it was helpful in a way that allowed me to see where I need to improve upon as a coach. Another coach, very helpful, gave me true insight as to what I needed to improve on, what I was doing well. Feedback from athlete survey was definitely helpful. Tells me how well I'm doing as a coach. And last one, the process is great. It works really well for me. And you see, it's meeting my needs. It's not what NASP says, or national standards, or the PYD literature, although that's hidden. We never tell the coaches those things, but it's all embedded in there. It's driving all this. And we, in a sense, kind of trick them into thinking, this is about your needs, right? So we've had lots of success, and they actually have an award in the school district, kind of like the Capital One Award in college, where they get points for competitiveness of your program. And this school had the second highest growth rate in that competitiveness score in the last year. So we're getting lots of evidence that something's happening here. So coming back, just going to finish here with one more example. I think if you take an integrated approach, integrated being that you combine athlete and coach development simultaneously, so athlete learning needs drive coach learning needs and development, and you integrate these three principles, they work. They work. The way you operationalize this in every setting will look different, no doubt, but the principles should be the same. And I love this quote from Pat Summitt. I just was reading this too before I came. I said, again, more evidence, right? Her definite dozen system that she talked about, winning all our championships at Tennessee, long-term repetitive success, because that's what we're striving for. We don't want a one and done. We want long-term success, building principled system based on these principles as anchors. Principles as anchors that drive what you do. And I think, based on the evidence and my 2 decades of playing with these ideas, that these are the 3 principles at the moment. Maybe next year it'll evolve, but at the moment, this is where I'm at. Thank you for your time. Thanks.
So just a big thank you for Dr. Gilbert for giving us a moment of your time and sharing your gift and all the research and giving us all a quite extensive reading list now moving forward after this. Mm-hmm. So we greatly appreciate it from the United States Olympic Committee and the Coaching Coalition. So thank you very much. So we can do maybe 1 or 2 quick questions, running a little late on time, but if anybody has a quick question, or you can come up and see Dr. Gilbert afterwards. We'll make you a little firing squad in the corner.
If you don't ask a question now, that's it. I'm not answering questions later. No, I'm just kidding.
What was the new journal that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, the International Journal of Sports Coaching. If I can get back here. International Journal of Sports Coaching. It's going to be released, publicized on the Human Kinetics website. If you go to the Human Kinetics website for their journals, it's a little ways back there, but I don't know, it's a bit far back. International Sports Coaching Journal.